Las Vegas, 1955. The neon lights never sleep in this town. They burn all night, every night, casting their gaudy glow out across the Mojave Desert like a dare, like a promise, like a lie, depending on who you are and what side of the door they let you stand on. The Sands Hotel stands at the center of it all. The Copa room inside is the most electric room in America on any given night. Presidents have sat in those seats. Movie stars have laughed at those tables. The champagne flows like water and the money moves like a river, and everybody inside believes, at least for a few hours, that this is what the good life feels like. And tonight, the man responsible for all of that electricity, all of that energy, all of that packed house, standing ovation, hold your breath and listen magic. That man is Sammy Davis Jr. He is 29 years old. He has one eye. He lost the other one the year before in a car accident out on a California highway that should have killed him and maybe would have killed a lesser man. But Sammy Davis Jr. is not a lesser man. He is a force of nature stuffed into a small frame. And when he walks out onto that stage, something happens in a room that you cannot explain and you never forget. He sings and grown men get quiet. He dances and women forget to breathe. He does an impression of Jimmy Cagney, then Humphrey Bogart, then Cary Grant, and the crowd loses its mind all over again. He plays trumpet. He plays drums. He taps his way across that stage like the floor is trying to keep up with him and can't quite manage it. The Sands is making a fortune off of this man. Every seat is filled. The casino floor after the show is packed wall to wall because people who came to see Sammy Davis Jr. don't want the night to end. They order another drink. They roll the dice one more time. They linger, because something about Sammy's performance makes you want to hold on to the feeling just a little longer. And then the show ends. The applause crashes through the Copa room like a wave. Sammy takes his bow. That deep, full bow he always gave. The one that said thank you like he truly meant it, because he always truly meant it. He walks off stage, still warm from the lights, still vibrating from the music, still wearing that grin that could light up a room all by itself. He walks through the corridor toward the lobby. And that is where the city of Las Vegas shows him exactly what it thinks of him. A security guard steps into his path. The man doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't have to. The message is delivered in the flattest, most matter-of-fact tone imaginable, which somehow makes it worse. Staff and coloreds, the guard says. Use the kitchen entrance. Sammy Davis Jr., who just made that hotel enough money to run itself for a week, who just made 500 strangers feel something true and beautiful, Sammy stops. He looks at the guard, and something behind his eyes goes very quiet. He had been through this before. Growing up in Harlem, traveling the country with his father and his uncle in a vaudeville act, pulling into towns where certain hotels would not take them, where certain restaurants would not feed them, where the geography of dignity was drawn in invisible lines that everyone could see and almost no one would challenge. He knew how this went. He lowered his head. He started to turn toward the kitchen corridor. And then a hand came down on his shoulder. Frank Sinatra. He had been standing just behind Sammy, still in his performance clothes, still carrying that easy, coiled authority he wore the way other men wore cologne. Frank Sinatra looked at the security guard the way a man looks at something he is deciding how seriously to take. He took his time. He let the silence do some of the work. Then he spoke, not loudly. Frank Sinatra never needed volume to be heard. If he goes through the kitchen, Sinatra said, we all go through the kitchen. And if that's how it is, then none of us go on tomorrow night. The guard blinked. Sinatra didn't. That was the difference between them. To understand why that moment mattered, why it shook the foundations of that city, you have to understand who Frank Sinatra was in 1955. Not just as a singer, not just as a star. You have to understand what he meant to Las Vegas, and what Las Vegas meant to him, and why, when Francis Albert Sinatra spoke, everyone in a room with a financial stake in anything stopped what they were doing and listened. They called him the chairman of the board, not as a joke, not as flattery, as a simple statement of fact. Frank Sinatra was the most powerful entertainer in the world, and in Las Vegas, the most powerful entertainer in the world was, functionally, the most powerful man in the city. This was a town built on entertainment and gambling, and Sinatra was the engine that drove both. When Frank Sinatra was booked at the Sands, the hotel didn't just sell out the Copa room. It sold out every room in the building. It packed the casino floor. It drove up the table minimums because the clientele coming to see Sinatra had money and were willing to spend it. Restaurants filled up, bars overflowed. The whole economic organism of the Strip breathed a little easier when Frank Sinatra was in town. Jack and Tratter, who ran the entertainment operation at the Sands, understood this better than anyone. He had seen what Sinatra did to a bottom line. He had seen the numbers before Sinatra was booked and after, and the difference was not subtle. Sinatra was not simply a performer. He was a financial event. And Frank knew it. He wasn't arrogant about it, not in the way that smaller men are arrogant. He didn't wave it around like a weapon looking for a target. But he understood leverage the way a chess player understands the board. He knew where his pieces were, and he knew what happened when he picked them up. He also knew something that the hotel owners and the casino bosses had perhaps not fully reckoned with, which was this: Frank Sinatra did not need Las Vegas. Las Vegas needed Frank Sinatra. That distinction, in a town built on the illusion of mutual dependency, was everything. But the power alone does not explain why he put himself in that corridor for Sammy Davis Jr. Power explains what he could do. It does not explain what he chose to do and why. For that, you need to understand the friendship. Frank Sinatra met Sammy Davis Jr. when Sammy was still a child, performing with the Will Maston Trio, his father and his uncle and himself, on the vaudeville circuit. Frank was already on his way up, already recognizable, already carrying that voice around like something he'd been born knowing how to use. And he watched this kid perform and understood immediately that he was looking at someone extraordinary. The friendship that grew between them was not the polished, press release kind. It was not two men who agreed to be photographed together and called it brotherhood. It was real. It was earned across years of late nights and shared meals and long conversations about music and life and what it meant to be the kind of man who stood for something. Frank saw in Sammy a purity of talent that moved him, and Sammy saw in Frank a kind of fearless integrity that he admired more than he could easily put into words. Here was a man who came from the streets of Hoboken, New Jersey, who had fought his way to the top of an industry that would have eaten him alive if he'd let it, and who arrived at the summit of his success without surrendering the part of himself that knew right from wrong. Sammy once said that Frank Sinatra was the first man of real power and real fame who ever treated him simply as a man, not as a novelty, not as an exception to some rule, as a man. That sounds like a small thing. In 1955, in the American entertainment industry, it was not a small thing. It was, for Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most significant things in his life. And Frank felt the weight of that. He understood what Sammy was living with, even if he couldn't fully understand what it felt like from the inside. He understood it well enough to be angry about it. And Frank Sinatra's anger, when it was righteous, was a remarkable and effective thing. Because what was happening to Sammy Davis Jr. in Las Vegas was not subtle, and it was not isolated, and it was not accidental. Las Vegas in the 1950s was, in the language of the time, the Mississippi of the West. The gambling industry had built a city in the desert and imported all of the ugliest racial customs of the American South right along with the dice tables and the showgirls. The hotels on the Strip enforced what were then called Jim Crow rules, the same framework of enforced separation and deliberate humiliation that had defined life for Black Americans in the South since Reconstruction. Black entertainers could perform on the Strip. In fact, the Strip wanted them. The white audiences who filled the casinos loved jazz and blues, and the kind of explosive, joyful, heartbreaking performance that artists like Sammy Davis Jr. and Nat King Cole and Lena Horne could deliver. The hotels were happy to put those artists on a stage and collect the profits. What they were not prepared to do was treat those artists as human beings once the performance ended. Sammy Davis Jr., after finishing a show at the Sands, was not permitted to gamble on the casino floor he had just filled. He was not permitted to eat in the restaurant that fed the audience who had just given him a standing ovation. He was not permitted to book a room in the hotel he had just made significantly richer. He had to travel across town to the West Side, the part of Las Vegas where Black residents and performers were permitted to exist freely, and stay in rooming houses and small hotels that catered to a clientele that the Strip pretended didn't exist. There is a story, and it is one of the ugliest stories to come out of that era, about a hotel pool. Sammy Davis Jr. was, on some occasion, permitted to use the hotel's swimming pool, an exception, a gesture toward normalcy. And when the hotel management discovered that a Black performer had been in the water, they drained the pool. The entire pool. They drained it and refilled it, as though the water itself had been compromised, as though a human being's presence in it had made it something other than water. When Frank Sinatra heard about this, the people around him said the temperature in the room changed. That is not a metaphor. The people who knew Frank Sinatra knew the difference between him annoyed and him angry, and they knew that when he was truly, deeply angry, something in the air around him shifted. He went quiet. He went still. And that was when you paid attention. He was not a man who wrote letters to newspapers about injustice. He was not a man who delivered speeches or organized marches. Those things were not in his nature, and he would not have claimed they were. What was in his nature was the direct application of force to a problem. He was a man from Hoboken who had grown up watching the world divide itself into people who pushed and people who got pushed, and he had decided, very early, which kind of man he intended to be. He started making demands. Not requests, not suggestions, demands. He told the management at the Sands, with the clarity and brevity that were the hallmarks of his communication style, that if Sammy Davis Jr. was performing at the Sands, Sammy Davis Jr. would be treated at the Sands with the same respect and given the same access as every other performer on that stage. He would eat in the restaurant. He would walk through the front door. He would be housed in the hotel, in a room befitting a man of his stature and his contribution to the hotel's revenue. Or Frank Sinatra would not be performing at the Sands. This was not an idle threat. The people in that room knew it was not an idle threat because Frank Sinatra did not make idle threats. He made promises, and the difference between a Sinatra promise and other men's promises was that Sinatra had both the will and the means to keep them. The men who owned and operated the Sands Hotel were not gentle businessmen. They were connected, as the saying went, to organizations that did not generally respond well to ultimatums. The casino industry in Las Vegas in the 1950s was, in substantial part, a creation of organized crime, and the men who sat across the desk from Frank Sinatra that day were men who were accustomed to being the ones who issued ultimatums rather than received them. They looked at Sinatra. They weighed their options. On one side of the scale, their principles, their customs, the system they had built and maintained, the social architecture that kept certain people in certain places. On the other side of the scale, Frank Sinatra. The economics of that calculation were not complicated. Frank Sinatra did not move. He sat in that chair the way he stood at a microphone, with complete and utter ownership of the space he occupied. There was no bluster in him, no performance of toughness. He was simply a man who had decided what he was going to do and was waiting for the other side to accept reality. He had, by some accounts, the contract in his hand, or close enough to it. The implication was clear, and it was not dressed up in diplomatic language. The contract could be torn up. The engagement could be canceled. The Copa room could sit dark. And every night it sat dark was a night the casino floor ran a little quieter, the bars moved a little slower, the whole economic machine of the Sands Hotel turned a little less efficiently. They did not call his bluff, because it was not a bluff. They said yes. And then Frank Sinatra pushed further, because that is what Frank Sinatra did when the other side said yes. He kept going, not out of cruelty, out of the understanding that halfway was not the same as done. He brought in his friends, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and yes, Sammy Davis Jr. And together, this group of men who would become known as the Rat Pack made it a condition of their collective presence at the Sands that the hotel operate without segregation. All of them or none of them. And all of them meant all of them had equal access to every part of the building, every facility, every room. The Sands agreed. And then, because the Sands was the standard setter on the Strip, because what the Sands did the other hotels watched and often followed, the pressure began to spread. It was not instant. It was not clean. The history of civil rights is never clean. There were still indignities. There were still moments of ugliness. The machinery of prejudice does not simply stop because one powerful man draws a line in the desert sand. But the line was drawn, and it held. Other hotels, watching the Sands navigate the economics of integration and discover that the sky had not fallen, that the casino floors had not emptied, that the audiences had continued to come and the money had continued to flow, began to make their own adjustments. Slowly, grudgingly, with the particular grace of men who are changing their minds for financial rather than moral reasons and would prefer you not notice the distinction. But they changed. The barrier cracked. And where it cracked, light got in. By the time the Rat Pack was performing together at the Sands in the early 1960s, those legendary shows that people still talk about, that people who were there still describe with a kind of reverent disbelief, as though they witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible but was. By that time, the Copa Room was integrated. The audience was integrated. The hotel was integrated. And Sammy Davis Jr. was walking through the front door. Not the kitchen door. The front door. Sammy never forgot what that cost Frank. Not financially. Sinatra could absorb a financial risk without flinching. What it cost him in terms of confrontation with powerful, dangerous men who did not like being told what to do. In terms of making himself the center of a controversy that he could easily have avoided. He had nothing to gain from this fight except the satisfaction of doing what was right for his friend. And in a world where most people find reasons to look the other way, that kind of friendship is not a small thing. It is one of the largest things there is. Sammy Davis Jr., in interviews late in his life, was asked about Frank Sinatra many times. He was asked about the performances, the parties, the legendary nights at the Sands. And he always answered those questions with warmth and humor and the storytelling gift that never left him. But when he was asked about what Frank meant to him personally, when the conversation moved away from the performances and toward the man, Sammy Davis Jr.'s voice would change. Something in it would get very quiet and very still. And he would say that Frank Sinatra was the man who made him feel, for the first time in a significant and sustained way, that someone with real power in the real world was going to use that power to stand beside him. Not in front of him. Not in a way that reduced him or made him a cause rather than a person. Beside him. As a friend. As an equal. As a brother. Frank Sinatra did not do this because it was easy. He did it because Sammy was his friend and his friend was being wronged. And for Frank Sinatra, that was the beginning and the end of the moral equation. He was not a complicated philosopher about it. He was not working through a political framework or calculating the public relations implications. He saw his friend being humiliated and he could stop it, so he stopped it. There is a word for that. It is not a fashionable word in an age that prefers its heroes to be complicated and its morality to be ambiguous. But the word fits, and the word is simply this: loyalty. Real loyalty. Not the kind you perform for an audience. Not the kind that costs you nothing and asks nothing of you. The kind that shows up in the corridor of the Sands Hotel when a security guard is pointing your friend toward the kitchen entrance and puts a hand on that friend's shoulder and says, without hesitation, without calculation, without a single moment of wondering whether this is the smart play: no, not tonight, not ever again. That is what Frank Sinatra did for Sammy Davis Jr. And Las Vegas has never quite been the same since. The neon lights still burn all night on the Strip. The casinos are still there, though the names above the doors have changed. The Sands itself is gone now, imploded in 1996, turned to rubble, and then to memory, and then to the kind of story that gets told in documentaries about what once was. But the thing that happened inside it, the quiet, furious, completely effective act of one man refusing to accept the terms that the world was trying to impose on his friend, that remains. It remains in every performer who walks through a front door without thinking about it, because someone before them made sure that door was open. It remains in the idea, which is not always honored but is never entirely abandoned, that loyalty is not just a feeling, it is an action. It is a choice you make in real time, under pressure, when it costs you something. Frank Sinatra made that choice. He made it in a hallway in 1955 while the casino lights hummed and the dice rolled and the whole gaudy, beautiful, complicated machine of Las Vegas spun on around him. He made it because Sammy Davis Jr. was his friend. And some things, the chairman of the board had decided, are simply not negotiable.